The subject that we have been asked to say something about is where is the European idea heading? Under text, what does events in Ukraine mean for the future of European integration? And I would of course argue that what's happening here is profoundly important not only for Ukraine, that's fairly obvious, but for all of Europe. Because fundamental principles of what we are trying to do, what we wish to do, perhaps what we dream about are at stake in developments in and around Ukraine. I would argue that it's a question of borders in Europe. And it's either a question of them disappearing over time or of them reappearing and us going back to a previous period in our history. Europe is a continent of blood, a continent of wars, a continent of armies moving borders between nations over the centuries. Poland can speak a lot about what that actually means. But when we came out of the devastating wars of the 20th century, and when we came out of the darkness of the decades of division at the end of the Cold War, I think the principles that were then established, or we tried to establish, were, number one, respect the borders as they are. And that was also a principle that applied to the then republics of the Soviet Union. They all had their right to independence, but the borders should remain. It didn't necessarily mean that these borders were particularly ethnic or logical in every single extent. I mean, if you go to Central Asia, look at the Fergana Valley. Those borders make no sense whatsoever from any conceivable point of view. They were artificial borders drawn by Stalin for some reason that defies belief. But at the same time, if you start to change them, rivers of blood will flow. And the same applied to the former Yugoslavia, where the constituent republics of the then Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, they were all given their right to independence, but not the right to change the borders or the boundaries between the then republics of Yugoslavia or the then autonomous units, Kosovo being one of them. And for all of the difficult wars that we went through during a decade of wars, of dissolution in the former Yugoslavia, we never agreed to change the borders or the boundaries, even of Kosovo. It could easily carved away the Serb part of Kosovo and give it to Serbia, and carved away the Albanian part of southern Serbia and give it to Kosovo. You could have carved up Croatia fairly easily, and you could have exploded Bosnia even worse than happened if you start to change the borders in accordance with old dreams of nationalism of the past. So that was a firm principle. And that principle has been violated in the question of Crimea. The other principle that we, then the alternative one that we try to say in Europe is, well, we're not going to change the borders. They are there. They're given by history for the one reason or the other. But we will have a process of integration where we make the borders mean less and less. The freedom of movement of peoples and ideas and capitals and goods and whatever, so that borders mean less. And of course, in the west of Europe, in the European Union, in most of it, you now pass these borders sometimes without even noticing that you pass them, because they mean so little when we go through a process of integration. And these are the things that are at stake. What Russia did with the invasion and later the annexation of Crimea, it violates the most fundamental principle, not only of the global order, because this sort of smash and grab operations, Saddam Hussein tried it once, these sort of smash and grab operations are a threat to global stability. Because if they are accepted at one place, they are likely to happen in another place. That other place might be in Kazakhstan, but it might also be in East Asia. And we enter a world of fundamental insecurity. But then it also violates that other principle that instead of moving the borders, we should make them disappear. And of course, what we are trying to do in the rather complicated, long-term, not entirely easy process of European integration is, as I said, to take away the borders. Enlargement happens, and we've gone through 20 years of miraculous success in the sense of the 100 million people really from the Gulf of Finland down to the Bosporus of 10 nations have become gradually integrated into the European Union, Poland being one of the, well, the biggest of the examples in terms of size. We are doing the same in terms of the Western Balkans, a very complicated process. It will take a long time because a fair number of these countries are far from ready for any sort of accession. But the important thing is that they take the one little step after the other to reform their societies, to open up their economies, to transform into more modern, viable, and competitive societies. And we've moved that principle forward of trying to help with integration. Eastern Partnership is a concrete example of this, trying to prepare, trying to modernize, trying to integrate, trying to help. And the same long term applies to Russia. We had a partnership for modernization with Russia. We genuinely believed in that. We talked about free trade. We genuinely wanted that. We talked about harmonization of regulation. We genuinely wanted that. And I can testify I was sort of prime minister a long time, well, some of us were prime minister a long time ago. And I signed the Treaty of Accession for Sweden on a midsummer day in 1994. And you would think that that was the most important thing that happened at that occasion on that particular day. No, there was another one. There was President Boris Yeltsin of Russia signing the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the European Union and Russia. And I vividly still remember the dinner that we had that particular evening. It wasn't the two of us. It was sort of the then Prime Minister and President of the European Union and the new ones coming in and the President of Russia. And most of that dinner was spent by President Yeltsin saying, I want to be with you. How do I reform my country? How do I secure democracy? How do we cooperate better? How could even Russia be part of this great endeavor of European cooperation? And we really worked closely with Russia for a long time to make this happen. That door should still be open. But when that door is slammed by Russia in the way it has been done, by the invasion, occupation, and annexation of Crimea, then we are in a fundamentally different situation. So that's why I'm saying what's at stake here in Ukraine is, of course, Ukraine, but it's fundamental principles of what kind of Europe are we going to build. Will we be able to continue to build a Europe where we integrate, where borders disappear, where peoples and societies move closer to each other? Or are we going back to Europe, where borders and boundaries are going up again, and where armies are starting to move to change these particular borders and boundaries? At the end of the day, blood will start to flow again in Europe, if that is the principle that applies. That is what's happening here in Ukraine is of importance to all of us, and why so much is at stake, and why we who believe in a Europe of peace and freedom really have to prevail with what is going on here. Thank you.